Hey everyone, welcome back to theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Again, that website address is theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Absolutely the best place online for clinical trials content and information. Today we're joined by guest guru Darshan Kulkarni, and he's been a guest of our show before. The links will be up there to our previous interview. He is an attorney. Well, he's actually I call him the triple threat. And you may want to kind of let us know exactly what it is you do, Darshan. But he's a lawyer, he's a pharmacist, and he's also an educator. Is that correct?
I'm a lawyer, a pharmacist, I'm an educator. I hate to add more things to it, but I'm also an author, and I also do a lot of regulatory stuff, so regulatory and compliance. So whether it's things like looking at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and how does that apply to people in the pharma industry, or looking at things like just evaluating how the regs apply, so the regs would potentially be applied by different agencies versus the actual Foreign Corrupt Practices Act or the False Claims Act or actions by the OIG. So I get involved in that. But yeah, I think overall, I think we'd mentioned before that I have written the chapter for the Principles and Practice of Pharmaceutical Medicine, the chapter in India. So I've had some experience there as well. But yeah, overall, you had the right thrust, so thank you. Thank you for having me again.
You're a quintuple threat.
So, he's the LeBron James of the research industry.
I can only dream.
He fills up the stat sheet. You get the points, rebound, assists, blocks, and field goal percentage. Well, like I was saying, Darshan, he's been on our show before. He's an attorney. He specializes in FDA law with clinical trials. He's extremely knowledgeable. We brought him on because there's a lot of new developments going on recently in the clinical trials industry. One of them is the Sunshine Act, and correct me if I'm wrong, Darshan, but this is a law that came into place that is not directly related to clinical trials, but it can be applied to it.
Correct. The Sunshine Act in general, basically what it says is, if you're going to pay physicians, we believe, as the United States of America, we believe that you are going to affect care, because if you pay physicians, they may get biased and want to use your product, not for a medical reason, but because you paid them. So the government basically came out and said, we would like you to tell us which physicians you are paying and how much you're paying to them. And this is a push towards transparency. Obviously, you're paying physicians for multiple reasons. Sometimes you're paying them because they are just contracting with you, providing clinical consultancy services. Sometimes you're paying them because they're doing clinical trials. Sometimes you're paying them to go out and talk about your drug. So it can be applied in a variety of different ways, and that's sort of where the Sunshine Act comes in. It talks about how these payments get disclosed. They originally had to be disclosed to HHS starting about 2013. There are some changes that have happened since the guidance came out, and when those disclosures will actually take place. But a lot of sites have, sometimes due to their own CIAs, but sometimes just because they have their own transparency initiatives, put out their information on their own websites where they disclose payments that they've made to physicians. So yeah, overall, that's what the Sunshine Act really is trying to do. It's been brewing for a few years now, but the recent guidance, probably close to about 15-20 days ago, that's sort of some of the latest news that's going on in the pharmaceutical industry that specifically impacts clinical trials. There are obviously a variety of different other issues that have become really quite important in the context of clinical trials.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to pull up the email, but I mean, I understand what the Sunshine Act, and I think most people in the industry they would agree with it, that pharmaceutical companies should disclose how much they're paying doctors to speak about certain drugs or this and that. But what I'm seeing is we're getting a lot of excuses when we negotiate our budgets and they just blame it on the Sunshine Act. Like, I remember I was negotiating a budget recently. I'm not going to name the sponsor.
Sure.
And they came back to me and said, and this was the first time I've heard it, they said, in order to comply with the Sunshine Act, we cannot go past this amount for this. And I thought it sounded like an excuse. I don't know if it's true what they're saying, or...
So there are a couple of things that come into it. Number one, companies have internally decided that if they're going to disclose how much physicians are being paid, they have to be sure that certain physicians don't get an inordinate amount of money. So when they're being asked for this inordinate amount of money, they're sort of saying, I'm going to have to put this information out there. It's going to look like I am paying off physicians. So they're internally developing like maximum amounts that they're going to pay physicians. And that might be part of the problem you're facing. But Dan, I do want to clarify, and I know you sort of mentioned this, but I'm obviously not giving legal advice right now, but I'm just sort of discussing just generic advice that may not be applicable to individuals. But so that was one issue, the Sunshine Act. Another whole issue that's come up is the use of the term fair market value. Do you happen to hear that word often?
Yeah, we hear that a lot in the contract negotiations.
Right. Do you have you heard about how that's being applied, or not so much?
Not really. No, it's a little bit unclear.
Okay, so the term fair market value really comes from, it gets applied in a variety of different ways. It gets applied in the context of the False Claims Act, it gets applied in the context of the anti-kickback laws, and it gets applied also in the context of international clinical trials under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Basically what they're saying is that the government is saying, if you pay off physicians, they will prescribe your drug more. Therefore, it costs Medicare money because of your payments to these physicians. Since you are impacting the quality, not necessarily the quality of care, but the cost of care, you as a pharmaceutical company are winning from this, and that is not acceptable. Decisions for which drug therapy you choose should be made by physicians without being influenced by pharmaceutical companies. Therefore, they should only be paid what would be considered to be fair market value. If they get paid more, that might be a kickback from the pharmaceutical company, or it may just be some kind of bribe. And that's sort of where the term fair market value comes from. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense. But I have a scenario for you. Let's say that you have the sponsors delaying making payment to you. The sponsor has agreed to, let's say, a net 30, but you're up to 90 days trying to collect your money from the pharma.
Right.
And you want to charge some interest, and they turn around and use that same reasoning for not paying you interest on the money that they owe you.
Well, that's very simple, actually. I would argue, again, it depends on which side of the argument you're on. They would obviously want to use that, but I would very simply say in the contract, when you agreed to it, that was fair market value. In fact, it's in the contract saying, I will charge you interest. And that is commercial fair market value. There's no person you're going to go to in the market who's going to say that I'm not going to charge you interest on money. Then why would I? If anything, you are not giving me appropriate money, therefore I'm not being paid fair market value.
Okay. That reasoning makes a lot of sense.
So basically, I mean, the Sunshine Act, when it first came out, I guess it was, most pharmaceutical companies, I mean, even though they won't admit it publicly, they probably didn't like it. They didn't appreciate that it came out. But as far as clinical trials, they may be using it. They may have found some positive out of it, because now, at least internally, when it comes to negotiating budgets, they can kind of keep costs down and justify it with this act.
I don't, at least my discussions with pharmaceutical companies haven't been in that context. For the most part, the big issues people have had with the Sunshine Act is no one really contests whether or not this information should be disclosed. I think that the Sunshine Act personally is a very blunt weapon for a very nuanced problem. The big issues that are there include, number one, it talks about payments that are given to family members. Obviously, there's a reason for that, but sometimes the family member may be doing something that's completely legitimate. What if the family member, a close family member, actually works for the pharmaceutical company? Suddenly, that has to be disclosed as a payment to the physician, even though that was for a completely legitimate purpose. The big issue you start seeing is there's no context for the information that's being put forth. So it doesn't say, I'm paying $200, of which $100 is for a clinical trial and $50 is for a drug dinner. It sort of just clubs it all together, and everyone assumes the worst. So that lack of context is often troublesome. As it relates to whether the cost of clinical trials coming down, my experience or my discussions have often revolved around the idea that pharmaceutical companies, for the most part, didn't worry too much about the cost of clinical trials. They tried to stay reasonable, but in some senses they did see it, in some cases, as almost like an advertising expense. They get to talk to thought leaders, they get to discuss with them, they get to see what's going on in the area of clinical trials. And now, with the limited funds that they can use, often because not only IRBs but also IROs are restricting what they do, these companies are now sort of looking back and saying, I can't talk to a lot of these thought leaders because I just can't afford them, because these thought leaders want a lot more money than I can give them.
Right.
So depending on which department you're looking at, they actually feel more handicapped than they feel, I guess, relieved. Does that make sense, Don?
Yes, it does.
Now, last time, well, thank you, Darshan, for clarifying and just giving us a little bit more information about the Sunshine Act. I know I'm active in this group on LinkedIn, and everyone's kind of having questions, and, there's no attorneys there, so...
I should probably get on there.
Yeah, it's actually called Save Our Sites. Just look it up on LinkedIn groups. But I'll put this interview there so that they can hopefully answer some of their questions, because lately that's been the majority of the questions have been around the Sunshine Act and negotiating budgets. Right. So I know that's a lot of the questions the sites have had.
Which also sends another bit of a conversation, is that it's very important what we have placed in those contracts when we first get started.
Right. A big issue you're seeing is actually the issue of double billing for sites. Have you guys faced that yet, or not so much? Have you heard about this issue?
Double billing?
Yeah.
Are the sites double billing our pharma, or is it?
Well, depends on how you look at it, I guess. But the big issue's been that Medicare and Medicaid will often land up paying for the standard of care. So, depending on how the contract is set up, it may be completely appropriate to pay for Medicare and Medicaid to pay for a portion of the quote-unquote study, as long as that portion is the standard of care. But sometimes the contract doesn't specify which portion is the standard of care versus which portion is actually the experimental arm. And in those cases, when it doesn't specify, and the site sometimes just goes and bills what it considers to be the standard of care, later on you've got HHS or the DOJ actually coming in, the Department of Justice later on coming in and arguing that you not only billed pharma for the clinical trial, but also billed Medicare and Medicaid. So even though in your head you were sort of saying, I'm just billing for the experimental arm, you may unknowingly be billing for the standard of care as well, effectively double billing for Medicare and Medicaid and pharma. And that has actually gotten a lot of people into trouble and resulted in multi-million-dollar fines, actually.
I can imagine. And it also leaves sort of a disdained look on research as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, you want to switch gears for a second?
Yeah,
Sure.
I had a couple of
Oh,
topics.
by the way, I did want to also add that on the first Monday of every month, I do a Twitter chat called RxCom, where we actually discuss compliance issues.
RX.
So the pound sign and then RXCOM.
Oh, okay. I'll try joining. I'll try getting in on there.
And that's the first Monday of every month.
First Monday at 9 o'clock Eastern Standard Time.
Oh, jeez,
of every month.
man. You're gonna get me up at 6 in the morning.
Don't worry.
No, 9 p.m. I should say that.
Oh,
9 p.m.
Okay. That's better.
Oh, okay. I was going to say, I'm up at that time, but get Dan up at that time?
That'll be a
But
challenge.
the sites may find it valuable because they get to ask a lot of these questions. We get to discuss issues that they're facing instead of just putting it on a chat on a LinkedIn board and then sort of waiting for someone to answer. Everyone sort of gets together and says, these are the issues we're facing right now.
Wow.
I'll definitely put that link in the blog as well when this video goes up.
Sounds great.
Okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about again what we started to talk about, what's going on in India. You know, it's been worded that a lot of studies have been placed on hold because of some issues there, and they were placed on hold by the government of the country of India. Am I correctly? The government body.
I saw that bit of news on your site. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen any other sources that from what I hear from your site, you'd heard it by word of mouth.
Correct.
Did you actually have a link to that? Because I hadn't seen a link to it from anyone actually writing up about it.
We were actually speaking with the physician who actually has a site there in India, and that's the first time we heard of it. And then we met with another gentleman who was who runs a very large investigational site, and he had resounded the same bit of information.
My understanding was that they had done a lot of delays. I didn't know if it was a complete stop. You may be correct. I just hadn't heard it yet.
Yeah, there's actually some of our viewers actually live in India and work in the industry, and there is some follow-up we've gotten on YouTube comments.
Okay.
And so it's probably somewhat credible because he left like 5 long comments, but basically he said there was some quality issues with just one CRO in India, and the media in India is so obsessed with sensationalizing any news regarding deaths. At least to my knowledge, there were no deaths reported. The actual news was that trial subjects suffered some adverse events, and when these people were contacted by media, they told that they were not aware that they were in a study.
Right.
And then he said, yeah, there was another newspaper article related to All India Institute of Medical Sciences, which says there are infant deaths, and the fact in this episode is also that the information from hospital statistics were taken out of context. So hospital administration came back immediately with a clear explanation, and it was never covered in the newspapers. Indian regulatory authorities are also very proactive and amending its regulations fast nowadays to make clinical research in India effective, blah, blah, blah. So basically it says bottom line is India is still good in research. Please feel free to contact me. It's not that Indian regulatory has put hold on all U.S. trials. They have put hold on all clinical trials happening at that particular CRO. And then an inquiry was made into the quality of research conduct at the site, and then subsequently withdrew the license of that CRO to conduct clinical trials.
Right. So that was sort of my understanding as well, which is that there's a slowdown. There, people are looking at these trials closer. There's a separate insurance issue that's sort of starting to pop up its head, and we can discuss that in a little bit. But there's a separate issue on true informed consent that has been raised a couple of times. But to sort of address your question directly, I'm not aware of all the studies themselves being stopped.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess they're going to be making a lot of amendments to make sure the informed consent process is better understood. So I think that's the bigger issue, is the, just informed consent in general in India. And
right. The issue is that you actually have a completely different healthcare delivery model in India. The concept of the empowered patient doesn't really exist in the form it does in this country. The empowered patient in this country is usually one who gets information from Google, gets information from a bunch of different sites, and goes to the physician and says, here's what I think is wrong with me, or here's what I think you should do. And the physician sort of has to backtrack and see if that's appropriate. The converse of this is you've got patients in India who often will defer so completely to the physician that they won't even know why they're actually doing things. The physician is often treated like a god, and there's complete and utter trust placed in that physician's judgment. And if he says you or she says that you have to be part of this clinical study, that's the final word. And that complete trust is, I guess, part of the problem, where people are saying, I've placed trust in you and you violated that trust for me. There's also an income disparity that has to be considered. Income is often a source of power in India, and the fact that there is this income disparity, often the people taking part in these clinical trials are often people who just don't have the income, and they participate in these studies either for money or because they're told to, and that portion of it also becomes a concern. On the flip side of this, there are some discussions going on where they actually are saying that that there should be some kind of adverse event insurance scheme that should be adopted in India. And there are a couple of countries who already talk about this or have executed on it. But basically what they do is, if there is a death or there is harm, there must be some kind of payout to the subject. And there's a discussion going on through that process as well.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for shedding some light on that, and thank you to our YouTube commenter for kind of bringing some clarity to the situation.
Yeah, I like to follow up with that YouTube commenter too.
Yeah, we should do another video on that just to clarify things.
And talk to them and have them explain it. That would be interesting.
Yeah. Now, Darshan, we're talking to Darshan. He's from conformlaw.com. That's his blog. Now, is that blog directly related with your law firm? Is that on the same website?
It is on the same website. It's just conformlaw.com. You can actually find the blog link right on top. Again, I don't actually give legal advice via the blog. I just sort of comment on issues I find interesting. Sometimes it's by me, sometimes it's by others. But it's often, I find it to be quite interesting because we talk about some of the legal issues, some of the regulatory issues. Often we talk about some of the ethical issues.
Ethical issues, yeah.
Yeah, we're actually doing a lot of discussions, especially starting this year, on ethical issues. We're talking about, for example, there was a study done in the past where illegal Latino immigrants were sort of put up in a Holiday Inn, and I think they did phase 1 studies on them. How ethical would that be? And the discussion around that. We're doing some discussions around the Sunshine Act. We're talking about if you ever heard of the Bhopal gas tragedy in India, and that was one of the reasons why these issues are happening. One of the delays in the clinical trials in India is basically almost 30 years ago there was Union Carbide had a leak in its I forget what kind of company it was, but basically a gas leaked out, and it hurt, I think it was hundreds of thousands of people in the area of Bhopal, which was a city. So imagine in New York City suddenly there's a gas leak and all these people are affected. That's sort of what happened. And then these people were taken to hospitals and suddenly enrolled in clinical trials, and they didn't even know that they were part of it.
Wow.
Sounds like Tuskegee all over again.
Sort of, isn't it? It's sort of like Tuskegee, actually. Yeah, Tuskegee was obviously well, in some senses it is like Tuskegee in that it's a long-term experiment. It is it's impacting impoverished people who don't know any better. Mm-hmm. And there were settlements done, etc. But in some senses, these individuals were victims first of the Bhopal gas tragedy, but then they were also victims of pharmaceutical companies who either for altruistic reasons, which would be doubtful, or sometimes it may even be credible. Actually, I don't know enough about that situation. But for either situation, they became victims of both being part of the clinical trial unknowingly and becoming victims of the gas tragedy. So we'll be having those discussions on the blog as well.
Yeah, speaking of ethical issues, and we're going to get into a little bit where we left off as far as recruitment and why some participants join trials, because there's a million different reasons why someone would want to join a trial. But there seems to be a group that just does it for money.
Right.
And we're going to get into a little bit of that, but can you give us a little bit of your, I guess, opinion, and it's not legal advice, just your opinion, on Quintiles and their latest, I guess, digital marketing initiative where they have these websites where if you're a patient, you can upload your medications and things like that. And so the idea is that if there's ever a recall on a certain drug that you're taking, you'll be notified. Or if you're taking two drugs that would counteract with each other in negative ways, they'll notify you. But really, they are using that information to recruit for clinical trials.
Right.
And a lot of the people inputting their information are not aware of that.
Right. And I mean, you have some obvious, and I'm hoping that their lawyers have looked at this and said it's okay, but there are some obvious privacy concerns that come up.
Right.
There are some obvious issues on just how data protection that comes up. There are some issues of lack of acknowledgement and basically how is this information being protected? What is it why is the patient doing it? Are they actually doing it because they want to be part of the clinical trial? Or are they doing this because they want to help quintiles? Or are they doing this because it just seems like a good idea and they don't know why they're actually doing it?
Right.
It's really tough to say. It would really depend on, I mean, eventually something like this could, and again, without looking at the site, I can't really comment, but sometimes a lot of these people just collaborate and form a class action and go after these companies. I'm hoping that Quintiles has already sort of considered the ramifications and said, we give appropriate notice, if you will. And despite the appropriate notice, if they choose to participate in this, that means that they want to be part of our database.
Right. And I'm sure just beyond the legal issues is the I guess just customer service. I mean, if the people are getting bombarded with daily emails about joining clinical trials, people will stop using it. So at that point, it's simple capitalism at that point. So I'm sure they have all the fine print. It's just interesting to get people's opinions on all these things.
Well, I'm a strong believer. If you follow the dollar, you'll find the truth. So, but I think this whole internet has brought about a whole new gamut of things to look at on the from the legal side, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, most definitely. A lot of things that were assumed to be okay are suddenly iffy. I mean, even if you consider something as simple, well, it's not really simple. Did you guys hear about the recent guidance from the FDA about unsolicited off-label discussions?
I saw some headlines, but can you get into that a little bit?
Sure. Basically, it's quite simply this. The physicians have always been allowed to prescribe drugs off-label. That's sort of, sometimes it's even the standard of care.
Right.
On the other hand, the FDA has always held the position, for the most part, that that pharmaceutical companies cannot promote a drug for its off-label use. That's always sort of been the standard. There have been certain exceptions, like if one healthcare provider wants to talk to another healthcare provider, and that discussion is being had in the context of a quote-unquote scientific discussion, which would, under constitutional scrutiny, be considered to be quote-unquote pure speech, it's considered to be protected. So if one doctor is talking to another doctor, and it's purely in the context of having a scientific discussion, that might be okay. Well, the FDA sort of, in the last week and a half to 2 weeks, changed the world. And they said that you can have, if a consumer, sometimes using a forum like Twitter or using a forum like Facebook or whatever, asks a question that's off-label, provided that you can contact the individual appropriately and actually direct the question directly to the individual and direct the answer directly to the individual and not on the public forum, you can actually answer off-label questions. Why is that important in the clinical trials world? It's important because now pharmaceutical companies will say, if I'm allowed to disclose that type of information, I would want to do studies that would, excuse the language, push the boundaries. I'd want to know more about if this drug works for certain off-label indications. So there'll be more research around more off-label indications. Sometimes they'll go all the way to actually getting an IND and an NDA approved, and sometimes they might just fail, and you sort of say, okay, this drug doesn't work for this off-label use. But now there's an incentive that pharmaceutical companies will have. This is part of the reason why the FDA was worried, because they were saying, well, does that sort of make patients not appreciate that this may not be a controlled study, or this study may not actually have all the checks and balances it should?
So if I'm a patient, let's say I have depression,
Uh-huh.
and I go to AstraZeneca's Seroquel fan page,
Right.
and I say, hey, does your drug work for depression, or can I use it for depression? Now they're allowed to answer. I mean, how would they answer that question?
So if it's an on-label use, they may say just direct you to the website that says, okay, it is used to treat depression. I think Seroquel is actually an antidepressant med.
Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong. But on the other hand, and I probably should actually check that out as a pharmacist. I probably should look at that. My recollection as it is, because it's used for a variety of things. So I don't know what the actual on-label use is.
Yeah, Seroquel is probably a bad example. But I mean, if I'm asking like an off-label question.
Sure. Let's take something like metformin. Metformin was approved for diabetes. It's actually pretty good for diabetes, but people have found that it actually also works for weight loss. As far as I know, it's never been approved for weight loss. Because there just aren't enough studies to prove that it does it. However, there is some off-label discussion to be had around that topic. Again, that's not medical advice, to be clear as well.
Right.
But let's say that is the topic. An individual could now go to the company that makes metformin and say, I would like to know if this drug can be used for weight loss. Now, if let's say you ask this on, like you said, the metformin used to be called glucophage, by the way. So let's say they would go to the glucophage website and say, we'd like to know more about this. What the company can't do anymore is say, the company doesn't have to answer if they don't want to. But let's say they choose to answer, they can't just put the answer for the off-label use directly on their fan page. They have to have a private one-on-one answer to that individual. So what that would mean is it may mean that they contact the person and say, you know what, contact this person at our MSL department or in our medical affairs department, and they will give you the answer. Or it might be more along the lines of, you know what, contact this person and they will actually give you access to a website that will give you the answer. Or they'll give you access, controlled access to just the answers you need. And then we'll follow up with you via some kind of written version. So there are a variety of different ways a company might take. This is so new that companies don't have processes yet to address this.
Now, is this kind of impeding these companies' social media usage? I know there were some pharmaceutical companies that just took off their fan pages because Facebook forced them to open it up for comments.
Right. So a lot of companies were taking off their Facebook pages for number one, this off-label discussion. For example, you can't go. The FDA actually gives an example in its guidance where it says that you can't go on your Facebook website and say, tell me about the uses that you use metformin for, because you're inviting off-label use comments.
Oh, okay. You're inviting engagement, which can be taken as marketing.
Right. So you can do the engagement.
Right.
So you're allowed to go in there and say, tell me about the adverse events you've had with metformin.
Okay.
But what you're asking by flipping the question around is saying, tell me about the off-label uses, and that might be a problem.
Okay, yeah.
Some of the other issues that I'm hearing too, and I know this sounds crazy, but it's how do you know who you're actually dealing with on the computer? If I'm on that end of the sponsor, and I've got someone asking these questions and asking advice, it could be a family member of the person.
Sure.
And for me, I mean, that would get into some really scary areas.
Well, it depends. For example, if I was a company, I wouldn't want to be the one giving the answer. I would want to be the one guiding the person to the information. So what I mean by that is, if a person comes on and says, what dose of metformin should I take? Or what dose of Seroquel should I take? If I was the company, I wouldn't be the one answering that. I would say, go to your doctor and talk to them.
Right.
On the other hand, if they say, is there any study out there that would indicate that this drug can be used for these other reasons. That's more almost like a librarian type function. Mm-hmm. And as long as you aren't saying that this might be right for you, or this is right for you.
Okay.
You see the difference between the two?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah. Dan just had to step away for a moment.
No problem.
He said,
Was the information sort of useful, or did you have any questions?
This is great information.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to get into before we wrap up here, Darshan, and thank you very much. I sent out a tweet for the RxCom.
I know that. Thank you.
Yeah, so hopefully people will start joining. I'll definitely join. I did not know about it, so I will definitely try to get on there. As we wrap up, can we? Because our last interview, we briefly, I guess, touched on this topic, but never really got into it. And I know you said you were thinking hard about it, long and hard, about study participants who do these trials. There's a group of them out there that do it strictly for the compensation.
Right.
And there's some that try to enroll in multiple trials at the same time.
Right.
Just to increase their income.
Right.
Now, who should take the responsibility for ensuring that that's limited as much as possible? Is it the drug companies? Is it the research sites? Who do you think should be the one responsible for kind of stepping in there and creating some type of guidelines?
Here's my question for you. Who would have the greatest amount of control over who would actually participate in that study?
It would be then the sites.
Yeah, so it'd be really tough to say the pharmaceutical company should have done better, but how would the pharmaceutical company know?
Yeah, because they're outside the whole thing. Yeah.
Right. So it'd be really, I mean, that's not to say someone's not going to try to blame the pharmaceutical company, don't get me wrong with that.
Right.
But it's really more a question of how would the pharmaceutical company have, I mean, that's sort of the reason why they have the sites, to have a physician there to exert independent medical opinion and say, well, I think this person should be in the study, I don't think this person should be in the study.
Yeah. And
Obviously, for a phase 1 study, it's a different argument than a phase 2 or 3 study.
Right.
But yeah.
It's tough. And that is a tough situation because a lot of times, people, they're just not honest about what's going on, and all they're thinking about is how they can monetize their situation.
Right.
Yeah, and
you can't blame them. I mean, sometimes they just sort of feel like, I need money, and this is the only way to get to that money.
Yeah.
And it's sad.
It is.
So, but the flip side of that is what you're really doing is you're potentially impacting the care that a lot of people should be getting. So, if it's a phase 1 study, you're just getting plasma levels, but if it's a phase 2 or 3 study where someone who could actually benefit from the drug later on, from actually having the disease state, you're potentially contaminating the results. And that might be problematic. Sometimes you'll find out that a drug that you were saying works doesn't, and you and a couple of people like quote unquote you come out and say this drug works, or that I had these side effects. And sometimes drugs that should have been approved don't get approved because you sort of contaminated the results, and sometimes drugs that shouldn't have been approved do get approved. So you sort of have to worry about that, and you have to weigh that in your own conscience.
Yeah, definitely a lot of ethical issues in this industry, for sure.
Right.
Did you see the article on, I think it was Pharmalot, about the MS patient in Germany?
Could you remind me a little bit more about it?
Yeah,
I may not have.
She was a lady in Germany. She had multiple sclerosis, and so she was gonna do this clinical trial. And so they gave her the consent form, and I guess she took it home to review it. Which is your right, by the way. If you're a study participant watching this, you should be able to take it home and review it before you join. But anyway, she did, and while she was being told about the study staff was telling her, yeah, I mean, basically, the worst that could happen is you may get flu-like symptoms.
Yeah.
And then when she actually asked her online community about it, her fellow e-patients, a bunch of them came out and said, no, that drug, I've known it to cause this and that, and a lot of them have said some pretty nasty side effects. So she ended up not doing the trial. Do you think those adverse events should have been put in the consent form, or is there a reason why certain adverse events would ever not be put in a consent form?
So typically, as you know, the most common adverse events that are put in are either the ones that are the most serious or the ones that happen the most often. So if an adverse event just isn't serious or doesn't happen often enough, it may not be. Again, you have to think about how an informed consent form is written. If it's too long, no one's going to read it. If it's too short but too complex, no one's going to read it or understand it. So you have to weigh and balance those two. Now, the big issue that you have is that when you're taking a complex document, often that's hundreds of pages long, and you're saying, I need to now make this into a document, and it's often full of these complex terms, which means that if those terms were simplified, it'd be hundreds of pages longer. You now have to take that huge set of information that you have and condense it into a document that's anywhere from a page to 10 pages. And at 10 pages, you're sort of pushing it. The question is, how informed can that consent be? And at that point, what information can you include in there? So that's sort of part of the dilemma that you have when you're constructing a informed consent form. You have, which is why you sort of need the help of the IRBs, who will take a look at the information that you have, take a look at your informed consent form, make sure that the most relevant information gets disclosed. And that relevant information, obviously, each company often defines what that means, but often the most relevant information includes either the stuff that's the riskiest or causes the most harm, or the stuff that happens most often.
Any other questions you have for Darshan, Don, as we wrap up here?
We could probably sit here and talk for another couple of hours.
Yeah, thank you for bearing with us, Darshan, with the video issues, but at least we've got the audio.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me, and I'd love to keep doing this on a pretty consistent basis. I always have a great time with you guys.
Well, one of the new things we're doing is we're doing the news panel. So we try to do that a couple of times a month, and we like to have guests come on. We'd love to have you come on and just kind of go over some of the headlines with us and share some of your expertise.
I'd love to do that.
All right, beautiful.
That'd be great. And so check out FDA Lawyers. That's the Twitter handle. Check out RxCom. And check out conformlaw.com.
That's great. Thank you.
You can get a hold of Darshan that way. And yeah, Darshan, thanks again. And we're going to have you on for those news panels in the future.
I look forward to it. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for watching. It's Dan and Don from theclinicaltrialsguru.com. Thanks a lot.
Take care, guys. Bye-bye.